Hi, Tim, and welcome to Sowing the Seeds of Change. It's a real pleasure to be talking with you today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Roz. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, really good to reconnect. I know you've been very busy recently promoting your new book, Post Growth: Life After Capitalism, which is going to form quite a bit of our conversation for today. And of course, it's the sequel, or maybe the prequel, to your book, Prosperity Without Growth. But before we jump into that, I always like to start by asking my guest, what's your favourite quote and why?
Well, I've chosen one for you that is a quote from the book, and I think because it sort of summarizes one of the key things about the book, and it's a quote from a Chinese sage called Lao Tzu, who was writing about 2,500 years ago. But it's a lovely kind of quote in the sense that it sums up one of the key messages of the book. And what Lao Tzu said it's a book called The Book of the Way, or sometimes The Power of the Way. And it was the foundation really for Taoism. And there's a wonderful quote where he just says that enough is enough to know. In other words, that sense of recognizing when we have a sufficiency, that's pretty much a central guiding feature of the good life, and that's very much a theme of post growth. And in particular, it's also a critique of capitalism, because one of my critiques of capitalism is that capitalism never knows when enough is enough, and it's always seeking for more. And in seeking for more, it kind of always pushes us relentlessly out of balance. So Lao Tzu's recommendation, his kind of this is about it, guys. This is all you need to know. When is enough enough? And asking ourselves that question is a good thing in terms of redefining an economy, but it's also a very interesting piece of guidance for our everyday life.
Yeah, it feels like a really important piece of wisdom that somehow at some point in the last 2,500 years, or maybe much more recently, we've lost sight of that. And in fact, it's interesting. In a way, I feel like the title of the book is almost a bit misleading. It is a book about post-growth, but I think it doesn't really bring out how philosophical, even somewhat spiritual, this book is. It is very much about, what is a life well lived, what really matters to us as human beings, because there is growing evidence that, certainly for those of us lucky enough to live in the developed world, that beyond a certain point, additional money doesn't bring additional happiness. In fact, if anything, it can become counterproductive. So I really love the way that you're taking economics and putting it into this context of
Yeah.
Humanity, which is really what's going on here.
Thank you. I mean, I sort of agree about the title. The title's a legacy. It's partly a legacy of the work that I've been doing over the last 2-3 decades, which has been around, exploring what an economy looks like when it's not growing, the challenges of that, the opportunities from that. But it's also a legacy from the original discussion that I had with the publisher, and they wanted me to be writing, something very much around that theme of post-growth, because they felt it was becoming a sort of important conversation. And I think it is an important conversation, but I was actually quite pleased when the German translation, the publisher for the German translation, said we don't really like this. Post-vaxtums doesn't work so well in German. Could you come up with another title? And actually, a close friend came up with the title of what is the German translation. It's being released in a couple of weeks, and it's just called How Should We Live? Which I thought was a really nice way of, in a sense, of capturing exactly what you're saying, that the theme of the book is like that. It's what can prosperity mean on a finite planet? How should we live under these conditions, and how can we make the most of our lives? Which, of course, is also, as you said, is the object of inquiry for philosophers from across the ages.
I think Lao Tzu would be proud of that lineage, because that sounds like much more what he was writing about, of
Definitely.
how,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
to live. Yeah, something that I've thought about a lot is the inescapable logic of the IPAT equation. Environmental impact is the product of population multiplied by affluence multiplied by technology. And there are some variations on this. And I think a really important one is the addition of wisdom into that equation. And it really seems to be that wisdom part that you're trying to bring, that you are bringing here, that sort of when we get out of the economic assumptions, what is the wise way to live on this earth, given that we have finite resources? So
it's perhaps also worth saying, I mean, I like that idea. I think we might actually, be on our way to a best-selling academic paper. If we were to put a W into the IPAT equation, I mean, people, make their careers off less. So we could definitely have a think about it. But it's interesting also how the conventional way of thinking about that IPAT equation is that wisdom is just in the technology component. In other words, it's about, knowledge and ingenuity and innovation. And of course, what you're saying is actually wisdom isn't just about technology. It is about the ways that we live, and therefore the T in the IPAT equation doesn't capture it for us. I'd be interested in a kind of mathematical form with a W in the IPAT equation, and also how you'd say it.
Exactly. IPAT, yeah, it doesn't quite roll off the tongue.
I don't know.
Although it feels like the W also relates to the affluence part, as exactly. a sort of I always feel like I want the A to be to the power of W, right. Which I'm sure mathematicians would probably take issue with as I exhibit my ignorance about mathematics. But it feels that if maybe there's another W in here as well, which would be, rather than affluence, having the word wealth in there, in the sense of what is true wealth, because it's not just the money that we have in our bank account. And again, noting, we're both fortunate enough to live in a reasonably developed country of Britain. And there's been a growing conviction on my part over the last few years that I've been researching this, that we genuinely can have a healthy planet and happier people at the same time. And somehow a lot of the language or the opponents of environmentalism have made it sound as if we're asking for sacrifice. I know that when you've published your first paper that was the precursor of Prosperity Without Growth, somebody asked if you wanted us all to go back to living in caves. So how do we get away from that false myth that we can't have like the best of both worlds?
Yeah, and that was really a lot of what I was trying to do in Post-Growth, in a sense, was to paint a picture of a world which was richer, which was more fulfilling, happier, if you like. The language of happiness is probably sometimes a little bit tricky, because happiness sometimes feels like, oh, hey, I'm happy, and it's all about kind of joy and instantaneous partying and being always up and up and up, which of course nobody ever is, really. And the people who pretend to be like that have got a dark side that's as deep as hell almost. But so it's not that form of happy, I think, is not what I wanted to be talking about, and not what people, when they think about happiness in the sense of classical philosophy, were talking about either. They were thinking more in terms of a good life, or as Aristotle would say, a virtuous life, a life worth living, and a life with fulfillment and with meaning and with purpose. And to some extent, one of my biggest critiques of capitalism is that form of happiness has been a casualty of the way that consumer capitalism in particular has propagated itself. We've been led into this dream of a kind of materialistic cornucopia. We can have everything we want and we could go on having it forever, and future generations will have even more of it. And apart from the ecological impossibility of that, I find it philosophically and psychologically bankrupt, because I don't believe that's what human fulfillment and human happiness is about. And I don't believe that when you ask people that that's what it's about. And I don't believe that philosophers of the ages think that's what it's about, or poets or dramatists or, novelists, that actually we've given away a sort of such an intricate part, an integral part of our humanity by thinking that we're just novelty-seeking hedonists who want more and more material stuff. And of course, as you say, it's really important to recognize that there are people in the world who don't even have enough to have a decent life. And that, I think, is where the metaphor of growth still has some resonance. But I think, when we take that metaphor of growth into the most advanced countries in the world, it is different things that we should be growing. It is our intrinsic satisfactions and our senses of well-being and our connection to other and the strength of our relationships. Nothing wrong with growing all those things at all, but they tend to be a casualty of the growth-based capitalism that we're living within.
I think a real challenge, and speaking from personal experience, I grew up in a family with, by British standards, not that much money. And it was pretty boring not having enough money. And I really bought into the Thatcherite, Reaganite story that money can buy you happiness, or at least it can buy you a big house and a nice car. And I had to actually experience that kind of wealth in order to realize, yikes, this actually isn't working for me. And it took me quite a few years of denial, going, well, I should be happy because I've got these nice things. And if I am not happy, maybe it's because I just don't have enough. Maybe I don't have enough money or a big enough house, and I'll be happy when. And so I wonder how we escape this sort of conundrum. I mean, maybe I'm just exceptionally slow and not very bright, that I couldn't use my imagination to realize that money can't buy happiness. If the people in the world, in the developing countries, if they all have to reach that point of having enough affluence to recognize that actually it doesn't work, that there are these much more worthwhile things that you talk about, like relationships, like having purposeful, enlivening work, then it looks like a pretty bleak picture for the planet.
There's a kind of, does everybody have to get over that in some way, in the way that you did, or is there a way of shortcutting that? I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I was always been fascinated with the work of Abraham Maslow, and he, in his early work, he pitched something which has been called the hierarchy of human needs. And to be fair, he did pitch it in a fairly hierarchical way. He said, first you have to have subsistence. If you haven't got enough to eat, then you're not worrying about what's happening tomorrow. And then when you get over that, you're worried about your social needs. And after that, how you get on with your neighbors and your relationships, and what your status is in the pecking order. And after that, if you're lucky, you can get on to your transcendental needs, this sort of self-actualization and this sort of higher developments of who we are as beings. And what struck me, what I found always interesting about that is that metaphor of the hierarchy stayed. It stuck somehow. It had a kind of sticking power, so that I can still go into, actually even boardrooms and government meetings and have people quote as though they've discovered it for the first time. It's all about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, isn't it? And what they didn't do was go back to Maslow and look at his later writing. For example, in 1968, he published a book and where he basically said, actually, the more you look at it, the more you look at the evidence, we're looking at a kind of duality in human nature. We're looking at this duality between our kind of material selves, which of course are dependent on subsistence, on decent housing, on good food, and to some extent also acquisitive of material things. But we also have a side of us which is much less material, which is actually much more social and is ultimately transcendental and possibly even something that we could call spiritual. And these two things go on in human beings at the same time, not one after the other. Not once we filled this bit, we'll go this bit. And there's some fascinating evidence from very primitive societies and historical cases where people have refused the sustenance that would keep them alive, sometimes to the point of famine, just because they had certain religious beliefs about the food that was being offered to them. And I think it's the case of potato in South America, which you in a country, and I can't remember which one it was now, but you don't grow stuff, you don't eat stuff that's growing in the earth. So they were being offered sustenance that would save their lives, and actually they turned it down because they had a spiritual belief. And of course, you might say, well, that's a bit dumb if you're dying of hunger. But what it shows, or what it illustrates, and I think this is a more general point, is that we do of course have that material side and that materiality to our lives, but we also have a spiritual side, we have a psychological side, a social side, and they're not one after the other. They're actually in duality with each other. And I think the reason, and I wouldn't, I'm not saying that it's at all, I was saying that you were a bit slow getting to that point. I think the reason most people don't get to that point is that we don't live in a society that recognizes that. We actually encourage those materialistic values over the social and spiritual and psychological values deliberately, because, that's what's going to make all the consumers that we need to keep the consumer economy going. So, and to me, therefore, that that I always go back to that idea that we have this duality in us, and that I think is a place. And it's also my experience a little bit after publishing Prosperity Without Growth, because it was written at the time for the UK government, as you said, and definitely for advanced economies. But what I was really fascinated by was the interest in that work from places I had never expected it, from some of the poorest economies in the world. And what they picked up on was this idea about the nature of our prosperity. And I remember this one conversation with a group of economists in I think it was Papua New Guinea or somewhere like that. And they were developing 100-year plan for their community, which economists that have ever developed 100-year plans. It's absolutely fantastic. And then we held the conversation by Skype. I spent the day with them by Skype talking about this 100-year plan, and they picked up Prosperity Without Growth, and they picked up, the some of the ideas in it about redefining prosperity and some of the economics in it. And I said, look, I'm really not sure I can help you that much, because I'm speaking to, advanced economists, to my own government, to my country. And they said, well, no, you can, Tim, because, your three principles are: establish the limits, look at where ecology tells you the limits are, fix the economics, and change the social logic, because the social logic of consumerism is leading us astray. Well, look, we don't have that social logic. We have a different social logic. So we're a third of the way there altogether. All we have to do is to protect our social logic, a logic that actually comes from a different place, a place where that duality between matter and spirit is held slightly differently from our very materialistic consumer societies. And so that gives me a hope, at least, that danger that you're suggesting, that everybody has to kind of get over materialism before they can arrive at something richer, isn't necessarily the case.
It's interesting that you mentioned Papua New Guinea, because that's where I landed up at the end of my Pacific crossing. And I got off my rowboat and onto a sailboat, which was a bit of a busman's holiday. But I remember being moored up in a little bay off an island where there was no electricity and no plumbing, but just as the sun set, hearing the laughter coming out from amongst the palm trees, in such joy being expressed, and in a way that you don't hear laughter reverberating around the streets of London. And so, that really makes sense that they have a less materially dependent form of joy, happiness, and fulfillment. But then in the developed world, does it ever feel like it's you and kindred spirits and the researchers that produce all of this evidence that more stuff doesn't make us happy. And in fact, people who evaluate their personal worth dependent on what they own are less happy than the average, up against this enormous advertising industry that is designed to make people believe that they are inadequate or less than if they don't have the latest fashions, toys, cars, whatever. It feels like that's such a sophisticated industry telling a very powerful and visually compelling story of people laughing as they drive their new car, or, you know, attracting a sexy partner because of the stuff that they own. How do we overcome those massive budgets and those massive influences?
Yes, I do sometimes feel as though that is a huge a huge opponent. It's probably quite interesting to see it as an opponent in a sense, because of the massive resources that are being marshaled towards that. And we should never forget, I think, that industry was constructed entirely for those purposes of creating desire, manufacturing desire. There's an early advertising book that I sometimes quote called the Science of Desire by a man called Ernest Dichter, and they were people, deliberately putting together that idea that what we had to do was connect people emotionally with material things in order to persuade them to keep on buying them, and that's the advertiser's job, is to create that connection. What does your pen, car, house, toilet roll say about you and status and your status in the world? And it's insidious. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. And I think it's absolutely, what's more, the sharpest end of that insidiousness, I think, is that we do that to our kids from a very, very early age, and their exposure to it is almost entirely unregulated. And even attempts to regulate, kind of above the line advertising on television and media and so on for kids of a certain age before the watershed or whatever, is now being undermined by social influences on social media and the impact that has on kids. I think that's an enormous and horrifying experiment with the values of future society. And so I do think, it's one of those areas that kind of comes out as being a place where we have to, in some ways, find the mechanisms through which we rein that back. And of course, at the individual level, with enough strength of will, people can do that. And one of the arguments that the anti-regulatory lobby in relation to advertising is that you need informed consumers who can take a sensible response to advertising and resist its lures when it isn't in their interest, and so on and so forth. And that of course, when you're talking about kids who are barely reading age and taking in visual imagery, which is incredibly socially powerful, I think is a nonsense. I think we have to go further than that. We have to begin to rein back the license that's been given to advertisers, and indeed to the people for whom that advertising is benefiting their market campaigns, and put in place the restrictions that will protect the values that matter to society. I don't see an alternative to that, and I do think we're kind of a little bit coming round to that in some of the even something as basic as advertising junk food to kids and restricting that a little bit because of the impact that has, not just on individual health but on national health and on public resources. So there's a very clear argument for that kind of intervention.
Yes, well, we intervene on exposing young children to too much sex or too much violence in the media. So maybe excessive consumerism and all of the impacts that has on mental health and physical health as well. There would be a very valid case for that. I'm thinking about Edward Bernays, who was the subject of a very good Adam Curtis documentary called The Century of Self. And I believe that he was a nephew of Sigmund Freud, and his book about So he's credited as being sort of the godfather of the advertising industry, and his book was actually called Propaganda,
Yeah.
which is pretty revealing and pretty terrifying.
Yeah, no, exactly. They knew what they were doing. It was deliberate. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Yes, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity for a reset. So we're talking now towards a year and a half into the COVID pandemic, and I was looking online to see whether economic growth had been slowed at all by the pandemic, and saw an article on the World Bank website sort of excitedly announcing that actually it looks like growth is coming back stronger than ever as we start to emerge from lockdowns. And it feels like that assumption of economic growth as a desirable end in itself is still as prevalent as ever, which is
yes,
kind of
it is prevalent. I mean, all of those, they're all very triumphalist, those kind of World Bank things. And there is a sense in which, when you have suffered the kind of recession that was suffered during the pandemic itself, that because you start at a lower level and because you kind of do bounce back a bit, the growth rate that you achieve is higher than the normal growth rates would appear to be. And so, at each individual point in time, the growth rate can look, for those who want growth rates to look good, can look pretty good. And really what matters is the sort of overall long-term average of those growth rates. And we're still not back at where we were before the pandemic entirely, but the growth, there is that sense of growth kind of bouncing back, and there's a sense of policy encouraging that bounce back as fast as possible, sometimes even preferring economic growth and the bouncing back of the market over the health of the population, which is kind of crazy in some way. And it's the opposite of the choice that we made early in 2020 to say, actually, what matters most as the basis of prosperity is the health of the population, and we can afford to let go some of this economic growth at that point in time because we have to protect the health of the population. And it's to me, although there is still that triumphalism, and it is powerful, I mean, it is everywhere, I can't really deny that, there is also a sense that that experience will have changed the way we think about our options for governance in face of something as challenging as the pandemic. And if there is anything as challenging as the pandemic, of course, it's climate change, and the loss of species, and those environmental challenges that we still have to face even the other side of the pandemic. So I've been kind of intrigued to see actually how those conversations have suddenly begun, perhaps for the first time, to actually consider whether some sort of post-growth ideas or some steady state ideas around the economy might be a part of the solution to confronting climate change in some places. So I don't want to oversell that, and in a couple of months' time in the COP, we'll see how well grounded that rhetoric is or isn't. But just seeing those debates, I find quite fascinating.
So I just want to take a short break now and to go to one of the questions that I ask all of my guests. Tim, if you were the democratically elected king or queen, if you prefer, of the world for a day, what would your first decree be and why?
I worry that this is a trick question, and that the right answer is that I should abandon the monarchy. But actually, I'm a closet monarchist in a funny kind of way. So I probably wouldn't do that, and I would probably situate for the purposes of this exercise, just situate myself as the Queen's consort, and I would pick up where the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, left off, because and it goes to the theme that we were talking about. How do we create this post-growth world, and how does it become a place which is rich and fulfilling? And to me, the Duke of Edinburgh scheme, which was a scheme that took young kids and taught them social values, taught them environmental values, taught them the value of learning a skill, was a program, that really speaks to that idea. I think we have given up on the development of people, of individuals, of kids in that rich and fulfilling way. And in doing so, we've actually robbed them of the satisfactions that come through that. So I'd pick up something like the Duke of Edinburgh scheme, and I kind of, I'd want that rolled out. I want access for kids so that they're not only bombarded by adverts on their iPhones. They're not only subject to the values that are being pushed by consumerism and celebrity role models, that they are learning the value of each individual person as the site of unique skills, abilities, and potentials. And I think that's a really important part of developing a post-growth world.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, I've done quite a bit of work with the Duke of Edinburgh scheme myself, as handing out the gold awards to the proud recipients, and just seeing like the beam of pride on their faces as they collect their certificates. I think that would speak volumes to them about the difference in the quality of the feeling between that sense of achievement and what it feels like to get the latest video game or whatever. Hopefully that would actually be experiential learning for them. So yeah, I fully applaud that. And I also hear you on the closet monarchist. Yeah, I find myself being quite a fan of the institution of the royal family for reasons that slightly mystify me, but I feel like something,
I know what you mean.
something very traditional, a sense of solidity would somehow be lost.
Yeah, it's really interesting also when you I don't know how much of this is real or not, but when you look at The Crown, the Netflix series on the monarchy, and particularly the early episodes of that, where they talk about how the values of the institution of the monarchy were quite explicit, quite deliberate. And what really struck me about that was that it is very anti-capitalist. It's quite hierarchical. You can't deny that. The monarchy is the step between the people and God, but you have to sort of say it's very anti-capitalist because it's placing power and hierarchy and influence at a different level in society than the level of the market and the dominance of the market. And that sounds like a bit of an ad hoc justification, post hoc justification for a closet belief that not everyone shares. I think we should recognize.
No, I like that story. I'm going to go with that one. Okay, now I feel vindicated. Thank you, Tim. So you serve as an advisor to government, to companies, and they bring you in to talk about your work in prosperity without growth and post-growth economics. Do you feel like they really listen to what you're saying, and do they take it on board and start to embody it, or does it sometimes feel a bit tokenistic?
Yeah, I mean, it's what I do struggle with that, to be perfectly honest, and I've done a lot of it, and sometimes I do, and I hate it. I hate that feeling when I come out of something thinking I've just been entertainment. I've just been fodder for either salving their own conscience or just entertaining their intellect, and it has nothing to do with the way the ideas translate into practice. But I also come across enough situations, I think, where I interact with incredibly bright, incredibly motivated, and incredibly well-intentioned people who really are trying to change those different systems from the inside. And I do think, and I think I would argue that I've seen those changes, not necessarily, I'm not claiming credit for them, but as part of a conversation that I am engaged in and have to some extent stimulated, I think we're looking at a very, very different place from the world that belonged to, Milton Friedman's famous edict that the business of business is business. Very few people trot that back at me now. Whereas even 10, 15 years ago, you would still get that. You sort of say, well, that's fine, but it's the rate of return that we're concerned about. Well, that's fine, but our mandate is monetary stability if you go into the central bank, or that's fine, but our fiduciary duty is to our shareholders. And of course, those fiduciary duties are important. They matter. They're still there. Sometimes we need to do a little bit of work on exactly what those duties are or should be. But the conversation is so much broader now that I, again, perhaps it's a bit of a sort of post hoc justification, but I do sort of, evaluate my time spent in those court jester situations, as I sometimes think of them, as being, as being worth the time. But I don't, I definitely don't like the idea that we're just kind of creating a sort of, salving people's consciousness or distracting them even from the damage that's being done. I think it's important to sort of maintain the line, to be really uncompromising, not to sell something as a message just because it's comforting or just because it's something that people will listen to. And I've never found that to be very successful, to be honest. I mean, the places where perhaps the biggest changes have happened and been made, of the places where I've been sort of most uncompromising. And sometimes when you're uncompromising, people will just not invite you back, which is fine by me, because there's plenty of other people still inviting me places. But sometimes when you're uncompromising, that really engenders, registers, it stimulates change, and that's quite exciting to see.
Well, I hope that the percentage hit rate, where you don't come out feeling like you've been the entertainment, but actually been taken very seriously and sincerely, I hope the percentages improve, because my word, we need it. I'm wondering, in those conversations or in other conversations, does equality come into them? Because there might be people who say, well, actually, it's not so much growth that's the issue, it's the way that growth is distributed, that it's still the people, the 1%, the people at the top, who are getting the lion's share of that growth, and trickle down economics doesn't work. So does that equality question form a part of
it
your
does
work?
it has to. I mean, I don't think you can really get away from it. And we did some really interesting work sort of valuing the impact of an unequal distribution of income. And what we figured out was that, if we had the UK's income was distributed more equally, we could actually do with 25% less of it, because the value of the inequality that was being created by this unequal distribution of income, with people, particularly the richest 1%, getting on average 6% richer every year over the last 20 years, that is deeply divisive, and it's unpleasant, and it creates conditions in society that don't work for everyone. As Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson showed, inequality doesn't just hurt the poor, it hurts the whole society. And when you figure out, the economic cost of that damage, it's substantial. It's 25% of the value of our output is wasted because we've got an unequal distribution of income. Turn that on its head, actually, we could be earning 3/4. We could have a degrowing economy, and if we distribute it more equally, the well-being outcome would be the same as it is at the moment. Or we could go somewhere in between and improve the quality of life of the poorest, moderate the gains in the richest. And to me, a lot of the trends in the last little while in terms of social justice have been not just in terms of well-being in some abstract sense going wrong, but they've had profound implications for social solidarity and for social stability, and to some extent, I think, underlie our experiences in this country through Brexit, the experiences of North America through Trump, the experiences of nationalism in Europe, a dissatisfaction with our society because of these vast inequalities. So yes, it's absolutely essential to thinking about a post-growth economy.
And yet it seems that there's still a sort of tacit acceptance of the status quo. I remember several years ago listening to Nick Hanauer's TED talk on the pitchforks are coming, and he was speaking as a very privileged person himself, saying that a society has never had this level of inequality without the pitchforks, the guillotines, and the rest coming out. And I'm not trying to incite a revolution here, or maybe just a little bit, but why are people not out in the streets saying this is not okay, this level of inequality is not okay, the damage that we're doing to the planet is not okay? There are some protests, but still a lot of people seem to be going along with what's going on? What's it going to take for people to say enough?
I think I don't honestly know, absolutely know the answer to the question, why isn't there more outrage? It does surprise me. I think we saw some semblance of that outrage, for example, on the streets during 2019 with the school strikes and Extinction Rebellion. We saw it in Occupy movement after the financial crisis, but we haven't seen it to the extent to which you would really expect to see it, given that inequality has gone on, not rising quite so fast actually as it happens, and to some extent being pushed down through the pandemic. But at least the obvious inequality within the pandemic, that it was the poorest, the marginalized communities, those with least secure livelihoods, who suffered most, not just in economic terms, but also in terms of their exposure to the virus itself. And that should be a cause for alarm for us. And I think at this point, it's very difficult to see where we are sometimes. It isn't like the financial crisis, where the obvious greed belonged within the system, and so the outrage was directed at those in the system. And it seems to be a kind of external enemy in some way, whatever we think about the origins of the pandemic itself and the origins of the crossover into the human genome. But it's external enough that we can't quite figure out, whose fault that is. And yet the inequalities are quite clearly the fault, the responsibility of society as a whole to fix. And it could be that what we're looking at is, we're looking at a situation where those who benefit from those inequalities have no desire at all to do anything about it, and those who suffer from those inequalities have no power to do anything about it. That's very, very, it's a very possible one of the reasons for the absence of the outrage that one might expect. But we do also see a social conversation which is about those with some power and some voice saying enough is enough. And I suppose, what we're looking for in a sense is a politics brave enough to give voice to that slightly muted outrage, to give it a place to go. And we saw in the UK, we got close to the politics of that with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour, and we saw it also shot down, I think, from almost every side and even from within his own ranks. And that to me was a very disappointing moment, not because I necessarily thought that Jeremy Corbyn was, a perfect leader or the right person to be there, but because the politics that he was espousing and the values of putting social justice at the heart of politics was something that I think needs to happen and needs to be taken seriously. And if Jeremy did a job, I think, during that time, it was to make that point strongly enough that the Tories were then able to pick it up and operationalize it in the red wall and in the kind of leveling up agenda in a way that has brought it marginally into the center of our politics, but nothing like enough. And I think we're still looking for those brave political leaders who are prepared to articulate that and be the mouthpiece, be the representatives of those who don't have the power to articulate it and don't have the voice to be heard. And that's a process that I think, comes and goes. It has its political waves. It takes time. And my hope is that we find that political wave before the outrage expresses itself with pitchforks on the streets, because I personally, think it's quite important to avoid that kind of violence. I don't think violent revolution has a very good reputation in terms of smooth, systemic human change. It tends to be associated with a shift from one set of bad values to another set of bad values, and with a lot of human pain and damage in the process. So I believe in a political process, I guess I'm saying, and what I would look to and hope for is political leaders who have that sense, the same sense that Jeremy did have, and actually that Robert Kennedy had in 1968, that the job of the politician and the job of government is to put social justice at the heart of what they're doing.
Absolutely. And I do also think, even while we look for that political leadership, there is also something of a responsibility on the electorate to let politicians know that that would be a vote winner. I'm reading a really inspiring book at the moment that's fiction. I rarely read fiction these days, but it's called the Dandelion Insurrection. And it is about a non-violent movement of protest against inequality, against planetary exploitation. It reads almost like a manual on how to create social change through non-violent means, and it's I don't think it's even particularly utopian. It feels like it could come true. So I recommend it as a very inspiring
Yeah,
read.
definitely going to look at that. Thanks.
Yeah. So I want to jump over to another one of my questions. I know during COVID, people's lives have been a bit disrupted, and maybe we've had more opportunity, more time, or more necessity to do things that we haven't done before. So, Tim, I'm wondering, what's the last time that you did something for the first time, and what was it?
I think it was today, right now, because I've never been interviewed by someone whose PhD I examined before. So that's a little bit of a cheat, I guess. I know that's not really what you're asking, but it is kind of weird, and I kind of quite like it, the role reversal that's happening here.
Me
I guess
too.
the the one thing that the lockdown, I used to go to the gym a lot. I think fitness matters. I think health matters and physical fitness matters. And so I really missed that. I really missed that kind of interaction. I started doing sort of online stuff. And because it was online, it was safer. For me, I started doing things that I had spent my lifetime avoiding, like yoga classes. So actually yoga classes online might sound nuts, but actually it's a really good thing, particularly, for inflexible men who have spent their lifetimes avoiding that. And I have kind of regained parts of movement that I never expected I would, really, that I thought I had consigned to history, basically. And so it's been a very important part of my lockdown.
Good for you. And maybe also a little bit less intimidating than showing up as a man
Oh
to a
yeah,
class of lycra-clad
absolutely.
women.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember doing it a couple of times, but then, that was it. It was once, and I was out that door as fast as I could. But it is pretty terrifying, particularly if you're a man.
So actually that brings me on quite well to my next question, because I'm curious about your personal evolution as a thinker, because your background looks very sort of masculine, grounded in maths and physics and economics, but it feels like maybe recently but I know that you're also a screenwriter, so a playwright, so you
Yeah.
are interested in the human condition, and you've always had that sort of like the balance of the yin and the yang. But I'm wondering if you are, like, from the inside, sensing an evolution towards more psychological, maybe even spiritual aspects of your exploration.
Um, it's interesting you should say that. I mean, at the beginning, I think you talked about Post-Grace as being a prequel rather than a sequel, and I think of it that way because actually I think I was always like that. As a kid, really. I mean, actually, when I was born, I think my mum hoped I was going to be a girl because she'd had a boy already, and then she had another boy afterwards. And so for a little while, I mean, there were a few kids after that as well, I have to say, and I do have some lovely sisters. But for a little while, I remember this, how kids sort of occupy different positions in the family, and my brother, my older brother, had all the power and no responsibility, and I had no power and quite a lot of responsibility. And that responsibility I developed, I think, as a kid, as much in response to my mother's side of the parenting as to my father's, and was instinctively her kind of her poetry and her love of nature and her femininity itself, actually, I think, were quite powerful influences on my life, even as my father was there kind of saying, you have to excel at math, you have to be good at physics, you have to be an engineer. And he wasn't, he wasn't doing it, he was doing it in a generational way. He was still that generation of fathers who drew their values out of almost Victorian models of parenthood, and there was that, that gender divide that was going on between my parents, and I was torn uneasily between them. And ultimately what screwed me, if you like, was when my brother chose to do languages and arts at A level, and therefore I was in a different place. I was being pushed into, keeping the truce, keeping the balance in the parental influences by choosing my father's side of the equation and studying maths and physics, which he loved. He really wanted me to do that. And then very slowly sort of coming back from that, I think, my professional life then was in economics. I, almost by accident began to be looking at the economics of technologies and interested in the economic questions. But at the same time, as you say, I still had this kind of alternative career as a radio dramatist, which is where I put all that slightly more yang side of yin side of me, I suppose. Yang was more in the professional life, yin was in the radio writing, and what I feel post growth for me, kind of a hope a little bit has done, has brought those halves of myself a little bit more into the same sphere, and that's the sense in which it's a prequel. Prosperity Without Growth was full of statistics and graphs and economics and theories and equations, and was talking to statisticians and to politicians about policies that they could do on Monday. It was very instrumental. I remember my mum looking at it and saying, "Well, there's lots of graphs in it, Tim, aren't there?" And yeah, sorry, Mum. I'll do something better next time. And sadly, she didn't live to see Post Growth being published. But I kind of like to think that she would have liked it, and she would have seen in it her influence as much as my father's, and she would have seen those things kind of coming together. And I recognize that struggle in men generally. I think we find it hard, and partly culturally we find it hard to acknowledge that side of ourselves. We find it's actually deeply uncomfortable in some circumstances, in some institutions, to recognize that, or it has been. But I'm also really encouraged to see that that's changing. I think in my kids' generation, I might be totally misjudging it, but I think that we are beginning to change and make more fluid those gender stereotypes, all the way along all kinds of different spectrums, and it's now a more comfortable place to be, I think, to acknowledge that we're not just this sort of set of yang dominated masculine forces that continually have to compete and show our dominance.
Yeah, it's time. Yeah,
I think it's time. I mean, I know from women's side that it's obviously time, but I think from men's side, I kind of feel like I understand, and it's a tricky thing to say, obviously, to any woman that men have suffered under this. I think they have. I think there's a deep unhappiness beneath our vision of masculinity, and I think there's also a sense of freedom in moving away from it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned earlier that inequality doesn't serve the rich really any more than it serves the poor. And I guess that the patriarchy is just another form of that inequality, that men suffer as much from it as women do. So, yes, I really hope that those old patterns of domination are dissolving somewhat now. And I sort of flip-flop from day to day between feeling optimistic that change and like this shift in consciousness is really happening, and then there are days when it all looks much more regressive. And but I see that flip-flopping as maybe a sign of the instability and the unsustainability, in every sense of that word, of the current system, and that change is coming.
Yeah, I think that kind of fluidity is a sign of change, isn't it? It's almost a precondition of change in some ways. So I like to see that too. And I do think, I think absolutely, in fact, and it's played out in the statistics, for example, that girls do better than boys in our education system now. And of course you could say, well, it's about time too, and they will have better opportunities coming out of it, and it's good. But it is also that there is something happening on there which is difficult for boys, and I think we have to recognize that and support it. Another justification in a way for my recommendation as Queen's consort, to give kids the skills that they need to develop a sort of well-rounded personality and a way through life.
So you mentioned your kids. How old are they now?
They're not really kids anymore, but I wish I could persuade them of that. They're just, I think, it's something wrong because they're a bit too comfortable, and they're still, at the moment, certainly the older two are still here, having both, for different reasons, I think, sadly, eventually given up on education, on higher education. And I think, certainly in the case of my daughter, who went to university at the beginning or in the middle of the pandemic, and basically had a year of not seeing anyone. None of the social life of being a student was there. None of the interaction with other students was there. None of the mentorship with tutors was there. And so quite understandably, in a way, she's kind of said enough's enough, and she doesn't quite know where she's going, I think. And my son somehow landed on his feet through the pandemic and had some online work, but has that fell foul of the housing market, which is a little bit tricky at the moment and unpredictable. And so he's also here. And of course, it's great to have so much time with them. And it'll also be nice when we get our space back. But it's, I find myself as a father terrified most of the time, because of almost, over terrified because of the work that I've done and my sort of knowledge about the fragility of the economy and of society and of the uncertainty going forwards. And I have to really kind of bring myself back to center and sort of say, you have to trust this generation as your generation did, found, its way through a world that is no longer the world of their parents, and that their instincts about that world actually are stronger than mine. And I think it's a very hard thing to do. I'm finding you've caught me right in the middle of a very, very difficult attack of that sense of terror about my kids' lives and the future of their lives. But I think the only thing that we can offer them is that sense of trust that they'll find their way through a world which is no longer ours. And it's a hard thing to let go of.
So for the benefit of other parents who might be listening to this, I wonder if there are ways that you've tried to prepare them for these uncharted waters that we're all sailing into or rowing into right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes to I don't know if we're there yet, but the sort of question that you wanted me to ask you, really, because I know, I suppose what I've tried to instill in them is resilience. So I took them very early into quite challenging situations in nature, for example. And I haven't tried to be sort of didactic, do this, do that, you must do this, you must do that. I've tried not to. Of course, every parent fails in that respect. But I do think that quality of resilience really matters. And it's what when I read about your adventures and your experiences, it's the thing that sort of fascinates me is where that resilience comes from, and what are the components of it, in very precise terms. So when you're in the middle of the Atlantic or the middle of the Southern Ocean, something goes dramatically wrong and your life is imminently in danger, it's that sense of resilience is the thing that makes a difference, really, ultimate difference between life and death in that case. And I just wondered if I can turn to that question to you now. What are the components of that resilience for you? What is it? How is it that we cope with that sense of adversity that is actually so powerful in that particular situation, is so powerful that it could, be life-threatening.
Thank you, Tim. That's a great question, and I'm happy I actually have an answer. So I taught a class at Yale for a semester, and this is going to be like the 3-minute version of a 1-semester class. I was framing it more in terms of courage than resilience, but I think the two are very closely related. And my, I don't know the correct mathematically technical term for this, but my central premise is that when your motivation is greater than your fear, then you're able to come back with resilience, you're able to act with courage, whatever is required of you in that moment. Because there were definitely a great many times when I was afraid for very good reasons. The ocean is not a very human-friendly place to be. There's a very good reason that most of us live on dry land. And so what I had to do on a daily basis was to reconnect with my motivation to keep on going. And I had multiple reasons why I was doing what I was doing. But the two biggest ones were the mission to raise awareness about environmental issues. I'd had this sort of belated environmental awakening in my early 30s and was just absolutely on fire with passion. To do that in the very naive belief that if I just said to people, hey, we've got an environmental crisis going on, that everybody would go, oh dear, we must do something about it. But anyway, there is a lot to be said for naive idealism. It gets
Definitely.
stuff. And then the other big reason why was my personal wish to find out what I was capable of. I'd had really quite an easy life, I suppose, in many ways, living in a developed country and having a stable family background. And I was in this very privileged position of being able to choose my challenge. A lot of people have challenges thrust upon them by bereavement, divorce, a diagnosis, bankruptcy, COVID, whatever. I was lucky enough to be able to choose these rather bizarre challenges of rowing across oceans. So I would draw on my motivation, and I also learned how to get a handle on fear. That I found that if I gave into my natural tendency, which is to sort of try and ignore the scary thing, to try and run away from it, that actually it tends to loom much larger when we don't turn around and look directly at it. And if I could summon all of my courage and stare it right in the face, it was like it just shrank. I actually saw that it was a very small thing casting a very big shadow. And so that was my formula that I actually still draw on, because I think we all get daunted by things, and especially those of us with an environmental mission. There are times that we just look at the scale and the seeming intractability of the challenges that we're up against, and it's easy to get a bit despondent or a bit hopeless or a bit overwhelmed. So
yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, that's really fascinating actually, because I as a kind of practical strategy, that sort of turning and facing a fear thing, we did a bit of work, and I talk about it a little bit in the book, on achieving this kind of state of fulfillment and flow, and the antecedents of it. When is it harder to do it, and why is it harder to do it? And we found this interesting thing, it's been found elsewhere, is that more materialistic people find it harder to reach that state of flow, even though it's the most satisfying thing in the world. Materialism actually stands in the way. And then we tried to figure out why on earth that is, and we discovered that more materialistic people tend to try and force the positive and turn away from the negative. So they turn away from undesirables. And yet all this energy that you take suppressing the undesirables, not facing the fear, actually takes away from the focus and the concentration that you need to achieve the state of flow. And it was absolutely fascinating discovery, really, that this kind of materialistic society was also one in which we were being taught to sort of almost evade fear, never turn around and confront it, never confront those undesirables. So it speaks exactly to that mechanism that we sort of uncovered in that study, and I think it's absolutely fascinating.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I love that sort of brought us back to where we started with Taoism, Lao Tzu, this idea of, in our developed world, it's almost like we want never-ending summer, we want never-ending light, we want never-ending happiness. Trying to ignore the reality of the need for the contrast, the yin, the yang, the darkness, the light, the winter as well as the summer, the hardship as well as the times of joy and happiness, that it's actually that creative tension between those two things that makes life worth living. And yeah, that flow state needs the difficulty and the challenge to bring out the focus that leads to the flow, like that, really paying attention to what we're doing. So I love it that we've sort of come full circle there.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite humbling in a way for me to, because I did it quite late in the writing of the book, sort of turning to Lao Tzu and his, Tao Te Ching, which I had read and looked at before, and I never really properly understood, I think, because it's quite elliptical piece of work. It's written in the form of these very short, almost poetic things. And there's a lovely translation of it by Ursula Le Guin, which became my sort of Bible for it in the end, because she turned it into such poetry. But I found so many of the things that I was talking about in a book that was written 2.5 millennia ago. And that sort of, in some ways, that gave me it was humbling on the one sense, we're not as wise as we think we are, of course not. But it was also, part of what I was trying to do was to say, actually, these enormous resources of incredibly creative people, wise people over millennia are available to us in thinking through the situation that we now face as a resource for creating a better society. They are still there. Their lives are still there. Their examples are still there. And post-growth, in one sense, I think of it as that way, of providing a set of resources for people who want to think through these things themselves and draw on the wisdom of the ages to be able to do so. Not imposing in a didactic way anything that any one luminary may or may not have said, but just acknowledging actually that the wisdom of the moment is a wisdom that we have inherited from our elders over millennia, and that is still available to us.
Beautiful. And I have the exact same translation, which, given that it is apparently the most translated book in the world, what are the odds we both have Ursula Le Guin's version of it?
It is a beautiful translation, though. It's really poetic rather than functional, and it speaks volumes.
So much wisdom there, and so much wisdom in your work and your life as well, Tim. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been so rich and deep. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on the show, Ros. And I'm really pleased that we did this little role reversal. Did I pass? You have to send me out of the room while you confer with your producer, and then tell me whether or not you want me to do revisions.
Oh yeah, we'll make you sweat. No, okay. You did a fine job, Tim.
Thank you. I'm really pleased. Okay.
Okay, you can stop recording now. I didn't stop my recording.